when you can see my screen. Get this out of the way. All right, let's try that again. Let's see. All right, can you see it now? Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, so we are jumping into the world of React today. And I'm not aware how much Wes has gone over that, but really what I want to encourage, as always, is focus less on memorizing, right? Focus less on that 100% understanding. It's all about immersing yourself in something new and utilizing the things that we've been learning prior to now in this new framework. And I say new framework because it's a new way of thinking of how we're handling web development. But as we start working on this, you will find that these principles that we're developing are going to be carried throughout other frameworks and other languages you might be using as well. So today, we are going to have our introduction to React. So not only understanding what React and how these frameworks operate, we're going to learn how to use components, which are our key building block in React, and how to pass data throughout them. Okay. So as always, let's do a little bit of a warm-up question here. Let's make sure we try to answer without looking at the answer first, right? So which one of these methods allow us to select a DOM element by its unique ID? Is it going to be A, where we do query selector, B, get element by ID, C, get elements by class name, or D, select all? I had to stop myself from reading it out because I think reading it would have given an answer. But yes, it is B. And there's other ways we could use this, right? So query selector, A would have worked, except we have a period in front of the ID instead of the pound sign, right? So we can use query selector to query by an ID. But if we know we're going for an ID, we could just do get element by ID, right? Um, it's really six in one hand, half dozen in the other. There's not really a right or wrong query selector here. Just make sure you're passing in the right argument. So what is the purpose of prevent default in form event handling? Is it to prevent the user from submitting the form, to validate the form, to stop the form from being reset, or to prevent the default form submission behavior? So we've got some D's coming in. Okay. And yes, it's D. The reason for this is because when a form is submitted, it typically refreshes, right? It refreshes the page. Because in the olden times, right, when it was more the Wild West, you would go to the next page. Whereas now maybe we don't want them to move page, right? Maybe we just want to display a message. So that prevent default is built in to say, hey, you know what? We know how you operate normally, but we're going to do something different now. Okay. So that's it for the warm up. Let's talk about front end frameworks. So at this point, we've got our basic foundation, right? HTML for the structure, CSS for the style, and JavaScript for the interaction. As I mentioned before, it's kind of like a sentence, right? HTML would be a noun, CSS is an adjective, JavaScript is a verb. So yes, there's a lot that we're learning here, and we're not fully done, right? But the thing is with frameworks is it starts to solve problems, right? We're not creating something to solve a problem that doesn't exist. These frameworks were a way to solve issues that front-end developers were facing by the basic limitations of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? So, it can be hard sometimes when you're not really quite sure what the right element is or how to do the CSS properly and the interactions with JavaScript, right? So again, as we go into React, don't worry so much if you haven't fully understood what we've talked about before, because as always, it's that practicing, it's that repetition for these things to really sink in. So frameworks, okay? So as I said, this is a way for us to really start taking JavaScript, HTML, and CSS and finding ways to better implement them. Right. So these tools called frameworks or libraries, it's saying it's leveraging JavaScript, but again, it's a little bit of everything, right? But mainly it's the JavaScript to make it easier to write interactive code. And that's the key thing here, right? Is with these frameworks, it goes less from a static implementation of a page and more how do we make reactive or interactive web pages. So these here, you may have heard of them. We have jQuery, Angular, Backbone, and Vue. Okay, so Angular is the one that I use on regular, pretty much a daily basis with my main job. jQuery was a little bit more prevalent back in the day. It's still used, but a lot of these frameworks have kind of solved what jQuery was there, or kind of consumed or subsumed what jQuery did, and these frameworks can do natively. Backbone was pretty popular back in the day, but React and Angular and Vue have kind of pushed it away. And Vue, same thing. I would say in popularity, you'd probably see React at the top, and then it's kind of a tie between Angular and Vue, depending on where you're working. So React, it says it's one of the most popular front-end frameworks. I'm going to be honest, it's the most popular, right? And it's not even just the fact that it's an open source framework through Meta, right, or Facebook. So it was developed by them to solve their problems, but they had it open source, which is why you'll actually see a bunch of React spinoffs. Who here in the class has heard of Next.js? Has anyone heard of that? Let's see. Okay, we've got a yes from Joseph. Let's see if anyone else. So the reason I mention that is it's a React framework, but it also allows you to have like an API or a server in the same application, right? So not going to get too far ahead, but again, they built off of React and they made their own framework, right? So React is favored really by a lot of software developers. When it first came out, there's a bit of a learning curve, right? Because Meta is the one who developed it, but people saw like, okay, this is doing something really unique. Let's jump on the bandwagon, but the documentation wasn't there. But now, I mean, it's not uncommon to find incredibly popular websites that use React. So when we get into React, it might feel like we're taking a step back, right? So, maybe like this sentence here is really important. So, learning React will not necessarily allow you to do something new that you couldn't already do with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? So, it's really doing things that we've been able to do, but the code is more maintainable, it's professional, and you're going to, again, see it's more reactive, right? And it's not a pun, but it's going to allow you to create applications and websites that are more in line with what you see traditionally, right? Where you press a button, something changes instantly. We're going to get into what's called state, right? That's like data management. And it's a lot easier to handle in React than it would be with HTML and JavaScript natively. Or you might hear the phrase vanilla JavaScript if you haven't heard that before. That just means plain, right? Standard. So a single page application. This is how React and some of these other frameworks, but really React changed what the front end experience looked like. So React allows you to create what's called a SPA or a single page application. So what's interesting about that is when you go through these websites, it looks like there's actually multiple pages, but there's really only one HTML file. So what helps here is this actually improves performance. It's a better user experience, and it's also easier to maintain. Um, so think about it this way, right? So imagine you had a blog, okay? And this is where we're going to get into components. But imagine you had a blog and you had a header, you have your main content, you have a sidebar, you have a footer, right? If you were designing this outside of React or component based, every single page would have to have the header, the body, the sidebar, and the footer. So if you made a change in the header, you'd have to change that header for however many pages, right? The single page application helps with that, so you wouldn't have to do that anymore. So a component is what really we'd consider the fundamental building block of a front end framework like this. So it's a modular or reusable. It doesn't have to be reusable, but it's an element on the page which can contain more than one HTML element. So really think of it like, I've got where's it at? So I've got this little Lego guy, right? So this here would constitute the single page application. The guy would be a component, right? And then we could say this is a component and this is a component. And the nice thing is I could take these green ones off and then I could move these components here, right? And it's just as easy as rearranging everything. So if you think of a component as an individual block that even could have blocks within blocks, you start seeing how this opens up our development experience. So when we look at this correlation one page, we're going to see what's outlined in purple as different components. Okay, so we have here a navigation component, and this is kind of guessing, right? But we have a navigation header component, we have our body component, and inside of here, we have individual components, right, for each different blog post. So the thing is, you can control how the components are broken up, right? We'll get into how you can make, even these blog post designs reusable, right? You could pass in different titles for a blog post and different images, right? So then you're not having to make this over and over again. But the important thing right now is just to start thinking about how you can break things down so that as you design, I'm sure you've heard the phrase dry code, right? Don't repeat yourself. This kind of helps, it helps lead towards that direction, right? Where instead of having 4 sets of HTML for each of these blog posts, you could theoretically have one. Okay. I'm kind of tracking so far. Again, I know we haven't looked at the code, but understanding this component driven architecture, are we at least understanding the general idea of why we're doing this before we proceed? If we don't, that's totally fine. We can spend some time talking about that. We've got plenty of time today. Okay. Timo, getting the concept. That's good. Man, I definitely missed being in here. So it's good seeing you all again. Looks like Omar's typing. Want to make sure, give him a second. Don't really see difference between the component and a div. Yeah, and as of right now, that's perfect, right? We'll start seeing what the difference is. But that's kind of why we've building that way, right? Because we know what's coming. So let's kind of help set the tone for that without me going like, hey, so you're putting everything in a div, which is really a component, which isn't, that wouldn't be helpful, right? But if you go back to some of those lessons, you may actually hear me talk about, creating sections and components, because that is ideally how you're going to be building. Okay. All right. So JSX is unique to React. And this is a file extension that allows you to write HTML-like code in a JavaScript file. This is awesome. And the benefits of this is you get all of that JavaScript, like you can iterate over things, you have conditionals, and it's right inside of your HTML, but it's still technically JavaScript. So this is one of the most powerful benefits to using React. Now, I will say other frameworks handle it a little differently, but it's all the same principle, right? I don't know over in Europe if you had the Reese's commercials where it's like, you got peanut butter in my chocolate and you got chocolate in my peanut butter, right? That's kind of where we're at now. Is previously we kept everything separated for the most part. Now we're starting to blend them in together, but it's got to be the right ratio, right? We're not just throwing everything into a bowl without measuring. We're actually going to see what the benefits are. So what before we get into the JSX, we need to create our own project. Okay, so this is where it's going to be really important to make sure you're not jumping too far ahead, right? Just go step by step. You're more than welcome to copy the instructions out here, but as always, I'm going to recommend that you type things out. Get your fingers working here. So what's really handy with React and other frameworks is you will have what's called a scaffold or a project generator. Okay, so this will actually set up everything for you, but you got to pay attention to the instructions. Okay, so before we do step one, we're going to run this command in the terminal that should have opened up here. Okay, so when we see npm create, this word here, it's spelled VITE, but it's VEET. And then we're going to do @5, and there's a space here, okay? And then we're going to do a dot. So breaking that down, we've seen npm before, right? So this means, hey, we want to run a script, and in our terminal, and then the create Veet @5. So what it's saying is, hey, we want to create a project with Veet, and we want to use version 5. Okay, so when you work on a different project, maybe you want to use a different version, but for keeping everyone on the same page, we're just going to do @version 5. Okay. And the period here is, hey, we want to create a new project in the current directory. You could replace this with the name of a new folder that you want to do, but just for the sake of our first project, let's do this all together. Okay, so let's do npm. I'll zoom in here a little bit. npm create Veet @5. We'll do space, a period, and we'll hit enter. So at this point, you're going to see, hey, okay to proceed? Yes. Okay. So if you remember earlier, I mentioned vanilla JavaScript, right? So you can use Vite for a bunch of different frameworks. Svelte is a very popular framework. I actually like it quite a bit. But you see there's Vue, Preact, Lit, Solid, Quick, and there's others, okay? But we want to use React. So let's make sure we go down and we select React, okay? Now, I'm going to stop here. If you can let me know that you're at this part of the screen, or if you're not here, let's go ahead and make sure we get you up to speed. Okay. So if you have any issues, please drop in the chat. Otherwise, if you can let me know that you're at this step 3, and then I'll proceed once I get some replies in the chat. Okay, got a thumbs up from Timo, Joseph saying yes, Omar, Chris. Okay. So I'm assuming if there's any issues, someone would say something now. So if not, like if you are having issues, you can always reach out to Veronica or myself as well. I like the zest. I mean, yes is correct, but zest, like I'm good with that. Makes me think of zest and ooh, lemons. Anyway, man, now I just want sand. So the reason why we're saying select a variant is because with V, you can do TypeScript or you can do JavaScript. And I don't know if you remember, I've kind of briefly touched on TypeScript, but we're not going to be utilizing that. That's something where if you want to chat on the site about TypeScript, I'd be happy to do that. But we want to make sure we go down to JavaScript and not SWC. Okay, so just JavaScript, and we're going to hit enter. So now you're going to see that boom, 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 the scaffolding is done. Okay. So what I want to show you here is SWC. Actually, Joseph, I have no idea. So let's find out. The JavaScript plus SWC. Oh, it's based on Rust. Interesting. Okay. Speedy web compiler. Ooh, I'm going to be going down a rabbit hole later. I don't know if any of y'all have heard of Rust, but that's definitely big these days. Okay, so a couple of things we want to break down before we go to the next step is right here. It's going to say major version of npm's available. Don't upgrade. Okay, so unlike iOS, right, where you go from like iOS 15 to 16 or 16 to 17, or Android versions where there's huge updates. Node and NPS is typically there can be big changes. But don't get in the habit of just blindly upgrading, because if something major does happen, it can actually screw up your entire application. And then you're just spending time trying to figure out how to undo things. So just throughout this curriculum, unless we explicitly tell you to upgrade Node or NPM, please do not. Okay. It's easy to undo, but we don't want to run into issues with that. Okay. So Now we're going to see that there's a few steps after this. So, or I guess, you see npm install and npm run dev. We're not quite there. Okay, we're going to get to that here shortly, but we do have new files that are made. So the easiest way that we can look at that right now is let's type ls minus la. And in here, you can see that we now have some new files that were made. We have an ESLint file, a getignore, index.html, right? We also see a package.json file, okay, and a vite.config file. So let's go to the next page. And we'll start looking at what that means. So the files are ready to go, but we're not. Okay, so what that means is anytime you create a project like this, we are going to have to do npm install. Okay, so I don't know how much you guys have got into npm install. I tried to look previously, but how comfortable are we with the concept of npm install before I go too far here? Like on scale 1 to 5. 1 being the least comfortable, 5 being the most comfortable. Okay, so Omar's got a 1, 1. Perfect. That's what I assumed. Okay, so let's look at the file tree. And I'm not sure if you're going to be able to view this yourself. So in our Vite setup folder, you are going to see what's called a package JSON file. Okay, and I know it was already open, but I wanted to show you in the file tree. It's going to be inside of your project folder. Okay, so inside of here, you're going to see a bunch of things, and we'll get on a few. But the thing I want to show you here, these two, they're called dependencies. Okay, so you have a difference between dependencies and dev dependencies. The main thing is your dependencies. This is what's going to be required to run the application, right? And this was created by Vite, okay? But imagine you created a React application on your own, and then you installed a bunch of dependencies. A dependency being like, let's say you wanted to have a script that, a built-in script that converts Celsius to Fahrenheit, right? That could be a dependency. I don't want to get too far off the beaten path here, but if your application required that dependency, it would be in here to say React, and then this is the version number. Okay. Dev dependencies are more for for the developer to use tools, but not required to build the application. Like this would be required for you to run it, but this would be required for it to be built and deployed in the wild. So the main thing I want to reiterate on this, or want you to understand, is anytime you create a project from a scaffolding tool like Vite, or let's say you went to github.com, right? And let's do GitHub React. So if I went to React and I wanted to run this, you'll see that there's actually going to be a package.json file, okay? Here's all the dev dependencies. Here's some scripts. I actually probably know dependencies because it's its own framework. Let me find a different open source project. So let's see. Can anyone think of any open source projects that they've done? Actually, you know what? I could probably just do, I could do my own. So the point is, in the dependencies, when you run npm install, and let's do this all together. So you're going to see that this little animation's going, the loader's going. Do not worry about any of these warnings. I'll talk about those here in a minute. But what's happening here is now we've gone through this package.json file and we've installed everything that is required to run this application. Okay. This package.lock.json is like saying, hey, it's creating a file to tell you like this is exactly what needs to be done. Okay. But if I was to try to run this application without doing npm install, it would not work. Okay. So now by running npm install, we've created a node modules folder, and you're going to see there's a bunch of different folders in here. Okay. These are all of these like super baked in dependencies that React needs to run. Okay. If I was to remove this node modules folder, please don't do this. But if I was to delete this in the package lock JSON file, okay. If I was to run npm run start, it's not going to know what I'm talking about, right? If I do npm run dev, that's what I meant to do. If you try to run npm run dev, which is how we're going to run our application, which was similar to using the node command before, it's going to say v is not found. Okay, but because we haven't actually installed it. So I'm trying to figure out like a really broken down way to explain this. So it's kind of one of those things of like it is pretty technical. So it's the easiest way is just to explain what it does. So if I did npm run dev now, you're going to see that stuff changed, right? It ran my application because it knew what Vite was. It has this node modules folder and everything starts building. So we haven't got to what Vite's doing at the moment, but anytime you scaffold a project or anytime you clone a project from like GitHub, always make sure you're running npm install. That'll install all the dependencies and you should be good to go. But you have to make sure you're running npm install in the right folder. Okay, because that package.json file, imagine that is just like the instructions, right, for how to run the application. If you run it in the wrong folder, it's not going to do anything, right? Because there's no package.json file to take instructions from. Okay. If that doesn't make sense, we can come back to that. But just for the time being, let's just make sure we run npm install in this directory here. And again, we're going to see these warnings here, right? So this is what I was telling you before, where with Node, it's not worth upgrading. So sometimes you may have like, hey, this one isn't totally compatible with this version, etc. That's not a huge deal, just because things are always changing, right? It's kind of like with your iPhone, maybe you're still on iPhone 15 and the newest version's 18. The core functionality, as long as it's a warning, is still going to be fine. It's whenever you start running into actual errors and you will actually see that it won't let you do an npm install. Okay. So for our sake, these warnings here are just warnings. We don't need to worry about that. Okay. So this thing here that we're going to be doing, this is only for Codia. Okay. If you are developing on your own computer, you do not follow this instruction. This is just because we have to run things a little differently. Okay. So in your package.json file, you should see on line 7 where it says dev and Vite. Okay. After Vite, I want you to do a space, 2 hyphens, and type the word host. Okay. After we've done that, let's go back to the terminal and run that command I told you before. So npm run dev. And now in this tab here, where you have, mine says driver visa prints Ralph. I love these names. 5173.codio.io. If I hit refresh, I should see this. Okay. Before we get moving forward, let's make sure we can all see this. Okay. And if you can't, let's look at the error message. We can debug it together. So you can shoot me a screenshot, thumbs up, something like that to let me know that we're here, and then we can progress. Cool. We got 2 thumbs up. We got some fires going on. Is that one there? Yep. All right, we'll give it another 30 seconds or so. Oh man, Omar's been clicking away at the count. That's awesome. We're starting to get a preview of what that date looks like. I don't know if you all remember too when I got her. She was so tiny. She was huge now. All right, so we've got a few thumbs up here. I'm not seeing anyone saying that they are struggling. So let's go ahead and move forward. Okay, so we're going to recap everything we went over. Okay, so again, we ran npm create vite at 5. So we're saying, hey, and with Node, we want to create a Vite project version 5, and we're going to create the project inside of the current directory. Okay. From there, we ran npm install, which installed all the different packages needed to utilize that React project. We updated the npm run dev script so we can run our project in Codio. And then we ran npm run dev. Okay. I know we didn't spend a whole lot of time on the website because that's literally just a boilerplate. Whenever you use Vite to create a project, it's always going to have that as your template. Okay. So inside of the project, and this is what we're going to talk about, there's a couple of new files that we're probably not as familiar with. So our index.html, yes, we've seen that, but it's going to look a lot different. Okay. So we'll go over that. And then the source folder, that's what's going to contain all of our React code, right? And then from there, we're going to have a public, and this is the folder that really, once we create and render down the project, this is what gets sent out to the public. Okay, so we don't need to be messing with that folder at all. So when we go to the next page, you're going to see all of our files are still here, right? Because we created this project, they're not going anywhere. So on this page, we see that the server is running, right? We've already started the server on our end. So let's go ahead and understand how to stop the server, okay? So the reason I say that is because maybe you want to make changes without the server running. That's totally fine, right? So what we can do in the terminal is just do Control-C, and that will actually kill the server, okay? So realistically, you kind of have to, there's not a bad reason. I guess let me take a step back. It's not bad to develop while the server is running, okay? But maybe you do need to kill the server on this project so that you can start the server on another project, right? You can't have, so when you run this, you see that it's on port 5173. That's standard for Vite. Okay, so you can't have two projects running on the same port number. So maybe you want everything to be on 5173. So you'd kill the server on this one, you go to your next project, start the server there. Okay. And so you just want to make sure if you're not using it, leave that port open. Okay. But again, Control-C, easy way. Omar, yeah, you could set it to run on another port. That's just not really, we don't want to overcomplicate things, right? But you could theoretically do that. Yes. Just not you just also have to confirm, is that port being used by something else, right? So Vite's kind of, a lot of these frameworks have found ports that are not used by other things and they set it to that port. Whereas it's out of the scope of this course to be like, okay, let's look at all the different ports running on your computer and make sure you don't have anything already there, right? But yeah, you could technically do that. Okay. So let's look at our React code and start understanding why it's different. So this screenshot here was taken in VS Code, right? So you might recognize some of these icons here, but it's the same code we see. So like we mentioned, there's a lot of HTML, but there's also JavaScript in here too. So let's talk about that. What are some initial thoughts as we're looking at this file? Like, how does it make you feel when you see this and you're like, oh, this is not what I'm used to, right? So let's share in the chat. How are we feeling as we're looking at this? Titanic, okay. I mean, I feel like we haven't hit that iceberg yet. We'll try to navigate you around it, but a number of familiar things are there. Yep. So, that's really important, right? Is you may notice our source here is a little different, right? Not what we're used to. Um, there's also this here, right? This on click. Okay, here's an anonymous arrow function, right? So we're not expecting you to look at this and be like, oh yeah, all this makes sense. But we're going to really start breaking down how we have now incorporated JavaScript with our HTML. So in our component, our app.jsx file is going to be what's called our app component. And one thing I want to mention is naming conventions are really important. And what I mean by that is when you work on a team, it's very likely they're going to have structured naming conventions. And it's less about what you think it should be and more about what has the team laid out. And just in general with frameworks, you're going to always see the initial component be called the app component. Now you could change it. You could rename it to be David's component or Zartasha's component, right? But it's important to really kind of be specific and intentional with how you're naming it. And more than that, if it's already named that, it's not going to be the end of the world to just leave it, right? Because if someone else came into your project and they're looking for your app component and they can't find it, you may be creating more of a bottleneck than you need to. So let's look at this. So in React, components are functions, right? So this is technically a giant function where the first letter of the function is capitalized. So we're going to use what's called Pascal case, right? So every word is uppercase. It doesn't really care again how it's capitalized, but that's just kind of the established. Like in JavaScript, it doesn't, but in React, you do have to have a capital letter to start your function. Okay. So inside of here, you're going to see that there are a bunch of HTML elements, but as the instructions talk about, in a component function, you can only return a single element. Okay. So this element here, just these curly braces or the angle brackets, this is called a fragment, a React fragment. So by doing this, we are putting everything inside of a single component. Okay. Now, what we could do, if we really wanted to, is I could actually just make this a div, right? And it doesn't have to be a fragment. It's again one of those six in one hand, half a dozen in another. The reason why the fragment is important though is if you created a div, you would actually create an element in the DOM. So remember the DOM, right? We just talked about that in the last module. Whereas a fragment wouldn't. Okay. So that could help if you are trying to reduce how many different elements are on the DOM, because then you're making children of children of children of children potentially. So that's where if you don't have to put a div here, just do a fragment, right? It makes React happy, and then you're still just returning everything in here. Okay. But if I was to remove this and try to run the application, it would not be happy because now I'm trying to return 1, 2, 3, 4 different elements. Okay. So I could actually show you this. If I go to the terminal, I do npm run dev. Oops, I need to. That's not going to let me do it in here because I'd have to open up the tab. There would be an error when I actually tried to run the application because of that. Let me actually go back a couple screens here. To Omar's point, I've actually never tried to use fragments inside of regular HTML. So I don't know. Okay, cool. So what I did here is I removed those fragments, right? And you can see here a bunch of errors. Adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag, right? Because there's 4 elements that I'm trying to return. So if I just did a div instead, and then I hit refresh, we're fine, right? It doesn't really care what you're wrapping it in. But that's how you want to address that. As for more than one fragment, inside of a component, no, that is not suggested. But you could have more than one fragment inside of the entire application. Yes, absolutely. Just not within multiple components, like multiple fragments within a single component. Okay. All right. So after that, you're going to notice here it says export default app, right? So the default here, what we're saying is we want this to be used in another file. Okay. So we'll look at that here shortly. All right. Live stream. Jump back in here. Okay. So right here, what we're looking at in our app.jsx file. So default app component is a little complicated, right? So what we can do is let's go ahead and reduce, let's change our application. Okay. So let's from line 7 to line let's do 32. Okay. We're going to remove that. So it's just imagine it like a function like we'd write in JavaScript, right? So we're just going to do return. We'll do an H1 and say hello React. Okay. So now, if we go to the next page, and we run npm run dev, we see this here, right? So hello React. Okay, so I know the example kind of said before, but let's walk through how we do this, right? So in our app.jsx file, we are going to remove all of that code in there. So we should just see function app parentheses, and then we have our curly braces, and then we want to return this text, right? And you can put whatever you want in there. We don't, not really too worried about that. So from there, once we made those changes, we can run npm run dev. Okay. Now the nice thing about React is I could change this to say hello correlation line fellows, right? And it already updated because the server is running. I don't have to hit refresh. So that's one of the nice things about React is it kind of has what's called a hot reload. Okay, so throw a couple more exclamation names because I miss working with you guys. And I click here, we see that update. Okay. Is everyone tracking so far with what we did here is we took all of that code that Veet gave us, and now we're just throwing an H1 inside of our component. Any questions before we go to the next page? I just keep looking at the Titanic GIF. Okay. So, like I had mentioned, we see that there's this export line at the bottom of our file. So what this does is this allows us to utilize that function, that component inside of other files. Okay, so other JSX files. So if we look at the main.jsx file, we're going to see that we're actually importing app, being the name of the component, from the file of dot forward slash, which if you remember means the same directory, app.jsx. Okay, so this is declaring a new variable called app that's assigned the value of whatever default value is being exported from this JSX file. Okay, so again, like we talked about, the app is the default name for the main parent component that's just kind of established across the board. You could technically name it whatever you want. Okay, so let's try this. We're going to go ahead and start the server with npm run dev. Okay. So inside of our app file, okay, our app.jsx, we're going to turn it to my first React app. Okay. If you make that single change and you hit refresh, well, that's weird, right? So let's fix that. Let's export default my first React app, and let's see if that fixes things. Cool, it does. Because here we're saying, hey, we want to export this function. But if I say export default my first pizza, it has no idea what that is because we don't have a variable, a function, nothing named my first pizza. So we want to name it my first React application. Okay. Now, where we actually import it, it actually doesn't care. We could name this to be Dogman. My son loves those books. So I can name this Dogman. And right here, I could change this to Dogman and it would still import. Because what's happening is we're saying, hey, create a variable called Dogman from my app.jsx file. Obviously, we don't really want to call it that, right? We're not making a Dogman application here. So what we're looking at here then is this is how the actual application is being rendered. We're not going to focus too much on the semantics here. But again, what you need to understand is in the component, we create a function with a specific name. We export that function with that same name. And then we import it here where we actually want to use the component. Now, a little trick that I do, and I say trick, it's just a different way of doing it, is I would just typically, if I have a single function that I want to export, I would just do export default function as a single line. That's all you have to do. But again, it's just preference, right? So we kind of understood, okay, a component is just a function that has HTML and JavaScript and sometimes CSS. So we've seen how that can be merged, but that's not enough, right? We need to understand how we can actually start utilizing these components to build something more maintainable and arguably more complex down the road that we wouldn't be able to do with just vanilla resources. Okay. So, on this, Joseph, so I'll pause really quick. He said, if you have more than one function, you have to export all of them, right? Not necessarily. The reason being, and we haven't got there yet, is let's say you just have a function that is being used inside of this function, right? We can have functions that use functions. Maybe we don't want to export that somewhere else. We're just trying to export the actual component. Does that make sense? Got it. Awesome. Great question. So here, if let's imagine this is how the correlation one website looked like. Inside of our app component, right, we would have our return statement, which is really important, okay? Something that we haven't talked about very explicitly is inside of the component, the function, you have your parentheses, your curly braces, you have a single return statement, okay? These parentheses, it is very common to see people do curly braces instead. It needs to be parentheses, okay? So inside of this return statement, we have two components. We have navbar, and then we have a main section with a news and resources component. Does anyone remember what kind of element, like if it was HTML and we had this forward slash at the end, what kind of element we would call that? It starts with a V as in Victor. Just kind of throwing that out there. I know we probably haven't talked about it here recently. So it's called a void element. And it's because you're not wrapping anything inside of it. So the main, right, we're wrapping the news and resources. But since there's no like opening and closing tag, we would put this backslash right here. Okay. So in this code, we're seeing that we have these two components, navbar and news and resources. Okay. And even within the news and resources, we see that there are multiple components inside of there. So we have a section, and then we have news item, resource, news item, resource, right? So this is, again, generic boilerplate. But what this is showing us is that we have a app component with two components. And then inside of that component, we have two sets of two components. Are you starting to see here how we can start reusing things without having to type the same code over and over and maintain the same code in one place compared to four different places? Okay. So let's take a look at how this actually works. So we have changed this component here to say I am from Pasadena, California, which is a lie. I am not from Pasadena, California. But before we do anything, let's go ahead and start the server back up. Okay, so in our terminal tab, to npm run dev. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and change this to where you are from. Okay, so I'm going to change mine to Kansas City, Missouri, USA. All right. So let's go ahead and make a new component. Oh, now I'm starting to see everyone saying void. There must have been a delay. Sorry about that. Literally just got the messages right now. Okay, so let's make a new component. So in our source folder, we're going to see all of these different components. Now, it looks like the My Hometown component's already been made for us. So for the sake of this exercise, oh, because I was already in there. Yeah, for the sake of this exercise, let's go ahead and delete it. Okay. So I'm going to delete that. And then I'm going to comment this line out. Looks like whoever edited this last time did not undo their changes. Okay. So if we right click on source, we can create a new file. And let's call it, like in the example, my hometown.jsx. Okay. So in our app, right, we want to import that component. But we can't do anything until we actually export it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do it the way that I showed you before. To export default function my hometown. So remember, every word is capitalized, right? We have our parentheses, curly brace, and then let's do return. And since it's a single line, remember in JavaScript, if it's a single line return statement, we don't have to have our curly braces or parentheses. So we'll do it like how we see here. We'll do a paragraph tag and say, hello, I am from Kansas City, Missouri. Okay. So now what we'll do is inside of our app.jsx, we want to import my hometown from /my hometown.jsx. He said it's missing a capital T. So hometown, are you talking about hometown? Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say it's one word, but no, it's all good. All good. But so I'm gonna say too, typically, if like let's say you made a new folder and you called this component, right? That's typically how I would create my project, is have a components folder. So then I would throw the my components, my hometown into that components folder. So now I could just go ahead and say /component/my hometown. Again, it's up to you. That's what you might see typically. Because if you don't have a folder for components, then all of a sudden your main folder is just full up. So now inside of the return statement, if I want to import my hometown component, how would I do that? So I've already, sorry, utilize it, right? So I've already imported it. So how would I render it on the page? Okay. So my hometown, let's see if that works. Yep, it works. And here's to show you exactly like how this is really working, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 instances of that component. You don't see it typed out that many times, right? So hopefully that demonstrates how this component's actually working. It is a contained section of HTML and JavaScript, JSX, and for every component, it'll render a version of that component. Okay. So let's do the exercise, and then we're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Okay. So this here in this project, we're going to go ahead and do something a little different. Okay. I think what we could do is one, let's do this. Let's give everyone about 5 minutes to do this. Okay. And then let's take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and review that. So if it's 1 after now, I would say let's give us till 6 after to work on it. And then we could come back at 16 after.
Awesome, I love it.
I was not expecting that. All right. Welcome back, everyone. So looks like Timo sent a screenshot. Joseph just sent his as well. So yeah, it looks like we've got the general grasp of what we're trying to do here. But if you haven't done it yet, let's go ahead and just take, it should be about 3 minutes and we can go through this. So if think about it from like a design perspective, um, if I already know I have 3 components I want to make, right? I'm just going to go ahead and make the files. So I'm going to have my hobbies.jsx. I'm going to have my favorite media.jsx. Oh, I made a folder. Whoopsies. New file, my favorite media.jsx, and then my quote. Right. So I'm not going to actually fill everything out. I'm just going to put a couple things in here. Oh, wow. Yeah, Omar threw a bunch in there. Awesome. Man, all that Lord of the Rings. That's great. So again, the main thing we're looking at is how do we create components for this? So we could just go export default function, my hobbies, right? And then let's do a fragment element, do a h2, my hobbies. And I'll do a paragraph tag. It's not going to let me do any warm ipsum, so I'm just going to say hobbies, 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 right? So I'm going to replace this in each of them. So now I'm going to do my favorite media, my favorite media. For some reason, the lorem isn't working for me. That's all. And then let's do media, media, media. My quote, 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 quote. Okay. So the main thing we were looking at here is we have 3 components, right? Now, obviously, to utilize that, we have to import these components somehow. So in our app component, we want to import all 3 new components, okay? So what I'm going to do is, since I know those components live in the same place as my hometown, I'm going to copy that. So now you can just replace and say my hobbies from my hobbies.jsx, do my favorite media, my favorite media, and then my quote from my float. Okay. And then I'm just going to replace it here. And we'll do my hobbies, my favorite media, and my quote. So if I hit refresh, here we go. Right. So about me, I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. Hobbies, 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 media, 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 quote, quote, quote. Okay. So no, we're not doing anything overly complex right now, but that's not the point, right? We're not trying to get you to design something overtly complex before we understand the fundamentals. But as we've seen, each component's a function that contains HTML and eventually JavaScript, and we can reuse that however we'd like, right? So if I wanted to just copy and paste this a bunch of times, why would I do that? I don't know, but I could. Now we're going to see all over the place, right? And then if I go into my hobbies and say snakes, lots of snakes, and then I refresh, I change it in one place, but every instance of that component changed. Okay. So before we go to the next page, what questions did we have? Was there anything that was, a little tricky as we're doing this, or okay, so Timo asked, where do I save? It doesn't seem to matter. No, but assets folder is going to be more for like images, right? So think of assets like maybe a PDF file, images, logos, stuff like that, right? So I wouldn't save it there. Again, you could leave it in your main source folder as a component, but when you start building more complex applications, it's going to be really important, in my opinion. Like especially if you have a CSS file for each component, right? I would typically just make a components folder and either having everything in that folder, or eventually you may have like a pages folder, a components folder, and inside of each of those folders, maybe you have a subfolder, right? It's all going to depend on how complex your project gets and really the team you're working on, the kind of standards that they set. But as long as you do the import correctly, it doesn't matter where you put it. But if you're not going to put it in the source folder, I would put it in a components folder. Okay. All right. So let's reflect on React. Okay. So just always good to kind of reiterate things. We learn something new, we come back, we review. So React is a front-end framework that can improve a developer's experience working with front-end of a web application. So with our React project, we used Vite, which is a project generator. They create a template that we can go through and edit to get started. You may have also heard of Create React App. That is still an option, but it's kind of getting deprecated at this point. JSX allows us to merge HTML and JavaScript into a single file. And then React is built using components, which are chunks of JSX. They can be nested inside of other components. They can be reused. They don't have to be reused. But at this point, we haven't really seen a whole lot that's different than HTML and regular JavaScript, right? It's the reusability is new, but by and large, it's still the same. So now we're going to talk about props, okay? And this is what's going to help us save time when writing our code. So props is going to be shorthand for properties. So it refers to the fact that when you take a React component, you can use properties to determine how that component's rendered. So when we see here at this component, we see an array of skateboarding, watching romantic comedies, and baking. And inside of the My Hobbies component, we have a property here called list of hobbies, or I guess the prop called list of hobbies. And then we're passing in this array of hobbies. Okay. So now inside of the My Hobbies component, we can now access that array. Okay. So when a prop is passed to a component from a parent component, so imagine a parent and a child. I know we've talked about that before. So when the parent passes props to the child, it gains access to the child. It gains access to a special parameter called props. And inside of there, It's a key value pair. Okay, it's going to be an object. So that's where we would understand a phrase called passing props. So let's take a look at this example. Okay, let's run the application. So we see here the components rendering saying my hobbies include skateboarding, watching romantic comedies, and baking. 100% a lie. I would go to the ER if I skateboarded, rom-coms or whatever. And baking, actually, I do like baking sourdough bread, but that's besides the point. So we look here and we see that there's this array called hobbies, and we have a bunch of different hobbies, and it's being passed down through the props of list of hobbies. Okay. Inside of the my hobbies, we now have a props argument inside of our function, which we didn't have that before, but with functions, we know what these are, right? So it's being rendered as my hobbies include props dot list of hobbies dot join. Okay. So if this doesn't make sense yet, that's fine. So we're going to do this. We are going to open up our console. So you can see here in our console, we have an object called list of hobbies. Okay. And we have an array with 3 items. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the list of hobbies prop to say hobbies array. Okay. If I hit refresh, you're going to see it's not going to work. Now I'm going to do hobbies array, and we're going to see that it's back in here. Okay. So what's happening is from the parent, we're saying, hey, I'm going to give you, imagine it like a parent giving a child a gift, right? I'm going to give you this gift. And I'm going to change it back to what it was before, list of hobbies. I'm going to give you this list of hobbies. I want you to use it. Okay. The contents are here, right? This array. So the child is like, okay, cool. I have list of hobbies. And we're just using basic JavaScript here, right? To join each element of that array, right? With a comma and a space. Right. So we see skateboarding, watching romantic comedies, and baking. So if we update this to say coding, reading, and sleeping, right? We see the same thing here. My hobbies include coding, reading, and sleeping. Now, again, what we're doing here, this join, this is what we determined we want it to be, right? So if I change that to an exclamation mark, instead of the comma, we have exclamation marks, okay? How are we feeling about this idea, right? We're gonna have an exercise here in a minute, but does this make sense? The parent component takes data and says, hey, I want to give it to the child. I want the child to render this. And then the child component receives an argument of props and then uses the props inside of the component. Okay. Are we feeling good before we move to the next page? Looks like Omar's typing. Yeah, sort of. I need to try to say for sure. And that's perfect, right? So let's do that. So let's start our server. I'm going to close out the console here. Okay. So I'm going to go back and change this to a comma. That's a good one. Emma Stone. Okay. So now we want to, let's see. Okay. I was just trying to make sure I have an eye exam tomorrow. My eyes have been, oof. So we want to create a new array. Okay. So we're going to call it my favorite media. So remember, this is just an array. We're not creating a new component. So we're going to do camel case. First letter is lowercase. Every word after that's uppercase. So my favorite media. We're gonna have an array. I'm just gonna say anything, whole thing, comma, especially the. Okay. All right. So at least 3 items. Okay. Well, for my case, I'm just going to do 2. So make sure you have 3. And then we're going to create a new component in a separate file. Okay. So I'm not going to make a new folder this time. I'm just going to do a new file, favorite media.jsx. Okay. All we're going to do is return a paragraph element. So we're not going to worry about the text right now. So export functions, favorite media, return to. Okay. So now we're going to import it. We need to make sure we have it rendered under here. Okay, so if I hit refresh, we see here the component's rendered. Okay. So now we want to use the props functionality to pass this down to the child. So how would we do that? Let's determine a prop name, right? So we want to pass my favorite media down to this component. So what would you argue would be a good prop name to utilize? I would say there's no right or wrong answer, but I would say if your prop's called bucket of fries, probably not the best prop name. Let's see. Omar has media. Let's see what Joseph suggests. List of my favorite media. Yeah, we could do I think that would be fine. Let's do list of media. Okay. And then inside of here, we want to pass in the array, right? So these curly braces are a way to interpret JavaScript in HTML. Okay. So we'll say my favorite media. Okay. So if you leave those curly braces off, you're going to be in for a bad time. Okay. So make sure, see right here, it'll say JSX value should be either an expression or a quoted JSX text. Let's throw some curly braces around there, make it happy. So now we're going to go to my favorite media. So how do we access the props again, right? We have to be able, if I want to use the props in here, does anyone remember what we need to do first? I'm going to have to hide Emma Stone. That GIF is super distracting. Props. Okay. And where are we putting the props, Joseph? Or anyone for that matter? So Omar's voting const, not quite what we're looking for here. So in the child function, where do we access the props from? Right. So in these parentheses, it's going to be our argument, right? So now we have props. So remember in regular JavaScript, right? So if we had regular JavaScript here, we would say, I'll have a, oops, there we go. So let's say we had function test, right? And we said, or we just had a line of code, right? We said const pizza equals create pizza. We passed in pepperoni and cheese. I guess it would be an array, right? So let's do toppings equals array. Just bear with me here. So then we would pass in toppings, right, as an argument here. So inside of function create pizza, we would have toppings, right? So now we could access the toppings that were passed in from create pizza. This is the same thing, is list of media. We're passing in my favorite media. So instead of inside of the child, right now we have props. So now we can access those props. Okay. So now that we have access to those props, like we've always had access to it since it's being passed in, but now we're saying, hey, we actually want to use them, right? We can do the same thing that we had here. So we can go in, say my favorite media includes, and then we want props, but we can't do list of hobbies, right? We have to say what these props are going to be. So it's going to be a list of media. And if I hit refresh, we see anything Tolkien, especially the Silmarillion. Okay. So again, it's very important that whatever prop we pass it down, this is the name of it, right? That's how we're going to access it inside of this props object. We tracking? Feel good about that? And if not, that's totally fine. We've got time. I would rather make sure we go through this together, right, before we jump into to the lab. Give it a second. We're gonna have a little bit more practice. So Omar, for now, yes, all good. Okay. Can you go over it once? Yeah, we're gonna go over it again. Okay. So, and that's why I wanted to make sure that it's a practice thing, right? So we're gonna keep practicing here. So there's another way we can do this, and this is how you're typically going to see this happen. So as we mentioned, props are really powerful, but we're going to utilize map. Do y'all remember talking about map with arrays, right? So this is how we can iterate over elements in an array. We see here const students equals Pete Miller, Clark Green, and Aaron Hannon. 5 points to anyone who recognizes those names. So instead of utilizing a loop or the join that we saw previously, what we're going to do here is we have an array and we are going to map over that array and iterate each element of the array. Okay. So we see here students, right? So we're going to say, and this is inside of curly braces. So remember, in JSX, if we want to utilize any like variable or JavaScript, we have to have these curly braces. So we're going to say students.map, and you're going to see a student and an index argument here. Okay. So we're not going to worry about the index right now, but the student is going to be each element from this student's array. Okay. So if we had an array called animals, we could call this animal. Right. This part here doesn't really matter what we call it as long as it's descriptive, but this matters, right? Because we're saying we want to map over this array. Okay. So just to let you know, before we get into this, we may see a warning here that says, hey, each thing needs to have a unique key prop. Okay. The reason for this is because it wants to have a unique identifier for each thing that we're iterating over. We're not going to get super deep into this here because in a real world scenario, you would be getting your data from a database and there would be an ID. Okay, so we're going to kind of skip over this part here. This is not something that we have to worry about right now. We're going to get more into this in the next section. Okay, but if you could go back over, take a little bit of time, you could look at this. This is not super relevant for right now. Okay, so let's go back over our hobbies. Okay, so Sarah, like you're saying, let's look at how our props are working. Okay, so we have a array called hobbies that has these 3 items, and we want to pass in that array as a prop or a property to the child component. So we're telling the child, hey, I want you to look out for a list of hobbies, okay? And inside of this list of hobbies, I'm going to give you all these different items in this array, okay? So let's start the server. So inside of the my hobbies, we are taking this props argument, right? But this time, what we're going to do is we are now going to create a variable called list of hobbies, and it's going to be equal to props. Does anyone here remember if we create a variable from another data source, but then the variable name has the curly braces around it? Do we remember what that's doing here? I know you didn't go over it with me, but I know we've talked about it. Okay. So this is what we call destructuring. So what this means is instead of having to do props dot list of hobbies all the time, we're now creating a variable called list of hobbies based on the list of hobbies property that is inside of props. Otherwise, what we could do is say list of hobbies equals props dot list of hobbies. Okay. There's destruction is really handy, especially when you have a lot of different things inside of this value. But the point is we now have a list of hobbies variable. Okay. And inside of here, we're taking this list of hobbies, right? And we're now iterating over this. So we're saying, hey, array, I want to take each item in the array, which we're calling hobby, and I'm going to create a list item based on each item. So I could change this to be var, right? And inside of here, I could change this to be var. And it doesn't like that name. Let's change this to hob. Okay. And it does the same thing, right? So all we're saying, if you remember when we iterate over arrays previously, it's the same principle, right? This here is just saying, hey, this is going to be a single element inside of this array, right? We're just looping over the array. I'll change that back to hobby. Oops. But do you see, I mean, it's a little bit more code, but do we understand what's going on here? So again, we take our props being passed in from the parent, we make a new variable, which is just the props, right, coming from the parent. So now we have a list of hobbies. And now we have a unordered list. And instead of having to create an element for each one, we now are iterating over that array and it's dynamically creating a new list item for us. So if I decide to go in here and say reptiles, reading, sleeping, right? This is the only thing I have to change. It makes a new list item for me as that array gets changed. How are we feeling about that? Let's go over the exercise, right? Let's see. I'll give you guys here about 3 minutes. So let's go ahead and try to do this, okay? So we're going to create a new array within the app.jsx file called colors, okay? So 3 colors that you like, and we're going to create a component, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create an ordered list. So this one is going to be based on the order of preference, okay? So I'll help you get started. So let's just make a new component. So if you look here on the left, you're going to see loop props and pass props. Okay, make sure you're making it inside of the loop props folder. Okay. Let's do colors.jsx. And then once we've created it, we just need to import it. Okay. Let's take a couple minutes. Let's see how far we get, and then we'll finish this and go over the lab before we part ways today. Okay. Colors. Okay, thank you. So we've created that component called colors, right? But we need to make an array with those colors. So let's go ahead and do that. So my favorite colors would be red, green, and blue. Okay. Now we need to be able to pass those colors down as a prop. So I know we've done this a few times now. How would I do that? What would I need to add to line 13 to be able to pass down my array of colors to that component? Can someone share what they did to make that work? And if it looks a little bit different than I've got it here, that's fine, right? But let's see what you put in there. Still working on it. Hey, that's totally fine. Let's see, it looks like Joseph's typing. List of colors equals colors in braces. Yep, that's exactly what I would have done. So list of colors equals curly braces, colors, which is the array that we made. Okay. So then inside of our colors component, we want to receive the props, right? And honestly, like, let's just look at my hobbies. And I'm gonna say just copy this, right? So we're going to copy this and we'll change it. But so we'll do list of colors, right? Because that's the name of the prop that we passed down. So now we can say my favorite colors are, if you remember, it needs to be an ordered list, right? So we said it needs to be in order of your favorites. So we could just change this to list of colors. We'll do color and color. So if we did this right, I should hit refresh, and there we go. So the beauty of this exercise, again, is we're going over what we've already done, but just with different props and different data, right? So the main thing we want to focus on here is we have our data and we want to pass it down to the child, right? So think about it like this. You you could have data and pass it like different versions of a component that have different data inside of there, right? So I'm gonna do this here really quick, just for demonstration purposes. Const other colors equals yellow, pink, teal, right? So now I could say other colors. Like I understand it's not really my favorite colors, but this is the same component, but it's being rendered with different data, right? So that hopefully is helping you understand the power of these components is if you design them to be reusable. So again, if you think about like let's go to IGN, right? So this here, you could argue all three of these things are components, right? So we have a card with a backdrop image, a color background, and text, right? So you could think of this component and the props, multiple are image, um, overlay color, and text. So then you have four versions of that component, all with different props. Okay. Ooh, this is big news here. Huh. Didn't see that one coming. Okay. So again, you can use the same component over with different data. But obviously, you would have to pass in what you want to be, right? So before we go, I'll show you what you could do. Is you could say um, adjective, right, on here. We're gonna do a string. I'm gonna say favorite, least favorite, and then I'm gonna have so by passing in a new prop of adjective, I have favorite and least favorite. I destructured that prop as adjective, and now my component really is reusable. My favorite colors are, and my least favorite colors are. Again, this is a big deal. This right here revolutionized web development by being able to do the props this way. Okay. So keeping that in mind, your lab for this assignment is really just going to be what we've seen here. Okay. So you're going to create a new project with Vite, and you're going to have three components. You're going to have app, student list, and student. Okay. So you want to make sure outside of like your keys, right? You shouldn't have any errors or warnings in your console. Okay. So we kind of get you started here. So let's walk through this really quick before we go. Okay. So we're going to create a new project, right? With our Vite command. You need to make sure you update this to Vite -- host in your package.json file. That'll allow you to run your application. Okay. So you run the application. Here's some CSS to help you out. Okay. So in your app.css, there's really nothing there. So, and this is the lab solution, by the way. So ignore that. And then you want to replace the code with this boilerplate here. Okay. So from here, I'm going to let you guys kind of review this, but ideally, you're just going to be recreating what we see in this image. Okay. So there is going to be an ID. There's going to be a preferred name, a surname, and a grade. Okay. So you're going to see all of that coming from this data, right? So we have a const profiles, and here we're actually giving you the ID. So if you remember going back to when we were mapping over the props, right? So if we go into our exercise, our example here, that would be like you could have an index, right? So I'll let you guys figure out how to do that, but you will want to have the ID there. Where is the, oops. Okay. And then, so that's going to be your data. And you're going to want to create a table. Okay. So you're going to have your T-body, right? Oh, that's always funny saying T-body. And you're going to render all of these elements based on TRs and TDs, which I don't know the last time you guys worked on a table, but we're trying to break all of this down for you step by step as much as possible. But as always, if you need a hint, there is a solution over here, right? So you should have access to that. Can everyone confirm that on your screen when you're looking at the file tree, you can see the lab solution? Let's see. Looks like someone's typing. So are you going to show us the solution at the end of this session if we are not able to make it? So what we can do, I know this is going to be technically due by Juan, can you clarify? This is due next Monday, right? Okay. So you do have the weekend to go over it. I understand, we all work, and I'm not sure what your schedules are going to look like, but that's why we are, especially being this first React project, we are providing that solution for you. If that's something that would be helpful, we can spend a few minutes next week going over it, but the lab is going to be due, right? So I don't want to take too much time to go over that. That's something that if you would like that, let me know. I don't know if it's possible. Maybe we could even start a few minutes early for anyone who's available. But Omar, really quick on your screenshot, you're looking at it, right? So your lab solution folder, you're looking at what the solution is for that. Whereas if you look at step one, we have to create a new project, right? So the folder that you're seeing now is the solution. The folder you're seeing now, that lab solution, is going to be that's if you need help, you can compare your project to that folder. But in your terminal, you're currently in the lab folder, which is where you would want to create your project. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So we have about 3 minutes. I can stay for a few minutes after for anyone that has any questions. So, um, what before we part ways, like Zartasha, how can I help clarify this for you or for anyone else? Like, I definitely want to make sure we're taking a few minutes here. Um, but I will say I did review this lab a few weeks ago, and this does really break down everything. It's obviously not going to tell you what to do each step, right? But it is meant to break down the steps for you. But that being said, like what question you? Okay, you're going to watch the recording. Yeah, I think that would be helpful. Um, but I will say everything in here outside of the table formatting. Okay. So that's going to require you to think back to how did you design tables in HTML? Um, all of the logic for this, we've already covered in each of the exercises. So I could tell you, you could go back to mapping over props and get a majority of what you need to do for this. The only difference would be the actual IDs. Like I said, that's something I was gonna, I wanted to suggest you to go back and look at while you have time. If you go here to mapping over props, again, this is where we would see that you can look at how to handle keys, right? So again, your index is typically what you would pass in if you had that information. Okay. But obviously, we can't cover everything as much as long as I would like to do that. So that would be the only thing that we didn't cover outside of tables. Okay. So I will tell you this, I will keep my eyes peeled on Slack today and tomorrow. So if you have any questions, I know Veronica is always happy to help. I know she's been feeling under the weather lately, so if you have any questions, feel free to message me either in the live chat or DM, at least for today and tomorrow, and I'd be happy to help out as much as I can. Okay. So before we go, any questions? Otherwise, I think we are done for the session.